Welcome to this second episode of our Faith in the Parish podcast. Today we're seeking some theological and historical perspective on the parish. I'm Toby Boutle, parish priest of Swindon Newtown, and co-hosting with me is the Reverend Matthew Price, Vicar of Galston and the Bishop of Norwich's advisor on urban and estates ministry. We're delighted to be joined today by a panel very well placed to help shed some theological, historical and legal light on the debate about the parish. So it's a pleasure to welcome Matthew Chinnery, who is the former Diocesan Registrar of Chichester and St Albans, now General Counsel and Head of Legal Services at the Church in Wales, by Canon Dr. Jessica Martin, currently the Canon responsible for learning and outreach at Ely Cathedral, having served for many years as the parish priest of a multi-parish benefice. And Jessica is the co-editor of a book looking at some of the challenges faced by parochial clergy called For God's Sake, and by Canon Dr. Jeremy Morris, a priest and historian, currently the Church of England's National Advisor on Ecumenical Relations, former Master of Trinity Hall in Cambridge, and the author of A People's Church, A History of the Church of England. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really grateful to have you with us.
Thank you, Toby. I thought it was worth, as we begin our conversation, setting some of the context, and you'll know that we went out to General Synod members and asked them some questions about the parish and their views of the current strengths and challenges of the parish system in order to inform our podcasts. And it was almost unanimous that the real strength that General Synod members saw in the parish was the fact that it provided a Christian presence in every community. One respondent said the parish church is a state church and belongs to everyone within the parish boundary, whether of Christian faith, a different faith, or no faith. But the General Synod members also acknowledged that there have been large challenges in the parish system in recent times. One respondent said, for the last 70 plus years, the general trajectory for most parishes has been decline. Building costs were also mentioned, and rising costs of clergy, and the fact that more and more clergy are becoming responsible for large groups of benefices was also cited as a challenge. So I think it's important as we begin our conversation to get clear about what exactly we mean and what we don't mean when we talk about the parish. So Jessica, if I can begin with you, how should we define what we mean by the parish or the parish system?
The most basic way you could describe it is as a way of apportioning land. And before the Reformation, that apportioning was pretty much coterminous with civil districts. And after the Reformation, that didn't change very much. So any given bit of land within England would be would have its apportioned person, its parish priest, and it's called a parish because it's the place where the priest lives. From I think the 19th century, the civil districts are not necessarily coterminous with the parish, but even now quite a number of them are. I can't give you the exact percentage, but it's around about 60%, I think.
Thank you. I mean, Jeremy, Matthew, do you have other views, things to add?
I think I would, Toby, I would just add that, I mean, Jessica's, of course, absolutely right. And what also needs to be borne in mind is that often these medieval parishes were constructed around economic processes, particularly agriculture, and the need to move. This is particularly true along some of the upland parishes, including the North Downs and South Downs. You know, you get shapes of parishes that are determined in part by where a community needed to pasture its cattle. So, you know, these boundaries evolved over a long period of time, and they served the social economic purposes of the community as well as the religious purposes.
And I think the one thing I would add to that is that, yes, they have evolved, but I think there is a question which we're quite scared of touching is whether they should evolve more. And we tend to evolve parishes just simply by merging them. Whereas actually, if particularly in an urban area such as London, if you took a map and a set of pens out now, you would not divide it up in a particular way that we have now. You certainly wouldn't go anything like what you have on the ground at the moment. I'm particularly reminded. I used to serve on a PCC in a single church, fairly small geographic parish that straddled the border of 3 local authority areas in one tiny parish. And it had a road down the middle of it where it was very affluent on one side of the road and effectively estates ministry on the other. And the point I used to make is actually the people on the east side of that road would fly across the Atlantic Ocean more often than they would walk across that high road onto the other side. And trying to be the sole Anglican Christian presence in a community that's that disparate in itself is really difficult. And if you drew those lines on the map today, you certainly wouldn't draw them in that way.
Yeah, that's
so
really.
In trying then to define the parish, we've already started talking about history because it's something organic and inherited. So, Jeremy, I wonder, given how heated the debate about the parish sometimes is there light that could be cast on it by us looking more closely at the history of the parish system in
Oh, absolutely. This is going to be one of those panels, I think, where we all agree with each other. However disappointing that may be to some people, but I think, Matthew's absolutely right. I mean, the history is crucial to understanding how the parish has come into being and how it is today. I mean, you can't really understand why we have the distribution of parishes we have and so on, unless you take account of the history. I'll take one, just one example, very common across across England, is the impact of the railways on urbanization and on parishes. And in many cases, the railways are like motorways, flung across existing parishes and cutting them in half and so on. So, of course, the way the parish is now is completely bound up with the history of the nation. And you can't separate the two, and you have to understand the history to understand how we've got to where we are now.
And for me, one of the most interesting aspects of that, I tried to do some calculations about 2 years ago, and I think there are about 23,000 people in England who don't live in a parish, because there are still some areas, extra parochial areas, which for very esoteric historical reasons that we won't go into now, were either taken out of parishes or in very few cases never put in one in the first place. So the pedant in me does bristle slightly when you hear a senior prelate in the church talk about every blade of grass in England being in a parish, because it isn't actually quite true.
Jeremy, there is within the current debate on the parish, are there particular misconceptions that irritate you in the debate about the history?
We haven't got time to go over all of them, but I mean, one of them would be the idea of experiment is new, and that essentially what we face is a completely rigid, unchanging structure that now has to be adapted all of a sudden to a very rapid process of social change. Social change is unquestioned. It's going on. We do have to adapt and evolve further, of course. That's absolutely right. But the fact of the matter is that the history of the Church of England has been marked by many periods of experimentation, some that worked in a sense, some that worked gloriously, some that worked a little bit, some that didn't work at all. Perhaps just to kind of add as a rider, it is particularly irritating as a historian whose real specialism is in the 19th and 20th centuries, to hear people talk about the Victorian age as an age when churches were flung up willy-nilly without any thought about where they would be and so forth, because that simply isn't true. The Victorians had a very kind of organic, bottom-up idea about how you grew a parish, starting with a tin tabernacle, in effect, you bought from a catalogue and put down in a rapidly growing urban area. So, they were experimenters without question. So that's one, I think, one aspect of the current debate that does particularly annoy me. We're not looking at a sort of simple contrast between a static past and somehow a dynamic thinking forward present. This has run through the history of the Church of England almost from the beginning.
And this idea of mixed ecology that the Church of England has now, I mean, to what extent has the Church of England simply been parochial in the past? Can we look to history to see examples of something like mixed ecology at all?
Well, yes, I mean, we certainly can. Of course, that doesn't mean that there haven't been a sort of greater predominance of a certain form of kind of parish settlement. I mean, you'd unquestionably need to look to the 18th century and earlier for a period when the urban population was a small minority of the population. Most of the population lived in rural parishes, and those boundaries were pretty well settled by the 11th century. And there were changes of depopulation in some areas and villages being deserted and so on. But in the main, the pattern of parish was much more uniform than it is today. But in the 19th century, again, for example, really from the late 18th and 19th century on, we saw an extraordinary flourishing of all sorts of forms of different missions to railway workers, missions to seamen is perhaps the one surviving, or what I can't remember what it's called now. But there are many examples of these particular mission initiatives that were aimed at particular occupational groups, or that were aimed at rapidly urbanizing areas, as I've described. So the chapels within existing parishes, and also the development of all sorts of charities and so on that were a kind of efflorescence of faith in the Victorian period. These were all additional to the sort of basic structure of the parish system. So yes, it was a period of extraordinary experimentation, and with a mixed ecology.
Serving in a great railway parish, a lot of that resonates with me. Matthew, you want to?
Thanks, Toby. Matthew, if I can come to you next. Lawyers often get a bad press, but the reality is legal questions underline some of the current controversy around the parish. It came up in the General Synod survey, and it's often mentioned, for example, the effect of the endowments and glebe measure of 1970. How important is this legal background in the shifting relationship between parishes and dioceses, do you think, Matthew?
I think it is very important, but I think probably what's more important is to put some of it in context. And I think we're going back to history again. I think one thing we sometimes forget in this debate is that for the vast majority of the post-Reformation Church of England, we've been looking at effectively keeping up with the growth that we needed, the growth in parishes, the growth in churches, and looking at ways to resource that. And then you suddenly hit a point, you can debate exactly when, but somewhere around 80, 70 years ago, where we go from trying to resource that growth to trying to then decide what to do as the church, the church militant at least, is shrinking. The church, of course, cannot shrink, but the number of worshippers on the ground has been going down, and the number of ministers we have to serve those communities and congregations has been reducing. So you had to say certain things to people and set up a framework so that we could get the resource in to build the churches and build the vicarages and make sure that the incumbents had money to live off. And so to create a new parish or to create a new community, you needed three things. You needed a church building, you needed a parsonage, and you needed some means for the vicar to have an income to live off. And so there was huge amounts of national resource put into that, public money, money from Queen Anne's bounty, some money from the ecclesiastical commissioners, but obviously huge amounts of local fundraising. And so communities feel that they built their vicarage, or they donated money to the scheme when something was starting up. And what that left you with is a huge amount of local investment and local investment in financial terms, but also in emotional terms in their local buildings and their local vicarage and things like that. But also it had created great disparity across England. You had rich parishes, you had poor parishes, you had what people will know largely from their literature as good livings, where a rector could do very little work himself, pay curates an absolute pittance to actually do all the work, but get all this income off huge amounts of land. And so the endowments and glebe measure, which was debated through the 70s and actually came into effect in 1978, was primarily an attempt to create fairness across the Church of England. The idea being that every incumbent received the same stipend for doing what was seen as the same job, rather than some getting several times what others were getting for doing identical work. And what that meant was it would be equally financially attractive to go and minister in a very poor area than it would be in a very well-off area. And that was hugely vital to ensure that we could continue to be in the Church of England a comprehensive church that's for everybody, and make sure that we were ministering in all the places that we were needed. And so what the endowments and glebe measure did was pool all the investment property, which previously had been managed at a local level to give the local vicar an income. It pooled all that at diocesan level in return for a guaranteed stipend. Now, it was quite controversial at the time. There were questions about whether parishes had really been informed and consulted properly. And also there was a feeling that people had given this land however many years ago for very particular purposes. And if it was suddenly taken at diocesan level, that wasn't what the bargain was at the point in time it was made. And then finally, there are arguments as to actually at what level would these investments be better managed. And I think nobody really knew that ahead of time. That was gazing into a crystal ball a little bit. Does local land management mean that you can manage that land both economically more effectively, but also more positively in your community than a big property department in a diocese managing it all? Now, in hindsight, what we've had costs for parishes going up, and they see parish share bills rising. And some parishes at least pine back to the days where they had all this glebe land which was creating an income, and that they didn't actually have to really give any money or very much money to the diocese at all. Now, that is undoubtedly right. Research demonstrates that the costs calls at a local level to finance wider ministry have gone up. It would be really interesting to interrogate the financial performance of all the diocesan investments which came their way in 1978 and see. But equally, that's not massively helpful in looking at where we go from here. I don't think we want to go back to the model of every parish for itself. You know, we are not a Congregationalist church. We are a Catholic church with a responsibility for ministering across the country. And I think there is goodwill from everybody around the table in trying to make that happen. It's just sometimes in the debates it doesn't really feel like it. And you know, I simply don't believe that everybody trying to make these decisions wishes to destroy the church. They wish to grow the church. They wish to nurture the church. And lots of us have very different thoughts about how we go and achieve that. But I don't think there is ill intent, whether to the parish system or whether to anything else in a mixed ecology. And it would be good if the debate could get past that a little.
Jessica, you've been in parish ministry in the past. I mean, I wonder what your reflections are from the front line, as it were, on this issue.
Well, one of the experiences that anyone who has ministered in a series of villages would be, and this is to state the obvious, that if you are looking after 3 or 5 or 7 different villages, you've got 3 or 5 or 7 different communities. Even if you haven't got your head of population might be smaller than a single urban parish, with all those administrative processes duplicated, which has been much talked about, but also very different social and economic histories and very different characters in those different villages. I mean, every village has got a different feel to it, and it's remarkable how quickly people moving into those villages take on the character of that village, so that long tensions continue, even if the people continuing those tensions didn't actually foster them or know much about them until they moved in. So you're always managing the good neighborliness of different communities, even if you were, and of course there is a very sensible move towards unifying those administrative processes. I think you've still got the distinctness of the different places, which are almost kind of symbolically as well as actually instantiated in those separate buildings with their separate challenges and their separate characters. That's to say the church buildings, which people constellate round, but also in some ways demarcate that difference. So it's a complex thing to manage.
Toby.
So Jessica, if I can ask you again, Matthew has said, of course, we're not a Congregationalist church, and I suppose for Anglicans, the local church really is in one sense the diocese, isn't it? But it is through the parish that most people relate to the church. So I just wondered, how might we understand the theological and ecclesiological significance of the parish? Is it just one way among many of organising mission in the church, or is there more to it than that?
I think the basic thing you might want to say about the parish is that it's a Christendom model. That is to say, it's a model that assumes that everybody who lives within that geographical boundary is in some sense a proper member of that church, regardless of whether they ever attend, regardless of their faith. And this is a model that made a lot more sense when that was more nearly true than it is now. But it's also one that has strengths that are quite difficult to quantify even now. My particular historical period is the 16th and 17th century, and one of the kind of interesting odd things that happen during the 17th century is you find Calvinist ministers who are naturally and instinctively Congregationalist in terms of their theology, saying that they are not comfortable with gathered congregations, because gathered congregations don't have the strengths of being part of that civic community. So they stick with the Church of England, even though they have ecclesiological arguments with it around episcopacy, and even though they have theological arguments with it around points to do with predestination, simply because they think gathered communities are much more vulnerable. And if one looks at the history of the historic free churches, you can see that there is a vulnerability there. And I have had conversations with my opposite numbers in the URC, for example, in which they say, we really envy that you can have some sort of civic entrance into everybody's lives, whether it's through the occasional offices or through other kinds of involvement, which we haven't got. And I think the great unknown that we have at the moment when we look at the parish system, which is one that's very costly for its ministers, because if you are ministering to the whole community, you may be spending your whole time doing funerals for people who will never, ever come to church. And you will be serving people regardless of whether they grow your congregation. I spent a huge amount of time working with, for example, with the school. And the thing about working with a school is that you might be doing all kinds of good things for those children, but without the parents, those children are not going to be coming to your church. So it doesn't look as if you're growing the church, even though what you are doing is giving the basics of Christian faith to large numbers of children. So I think there's a kind of cost-benefit analysis that people sit and do, and they say, how much return is there for the bread that we spread on the waters by treating everybody as part of Christendom when they're not? But on the other hand, if we just gather the church, are we going to get like-minded folk, as it might be, an awful lot of young professionals, but not much of anybody else in the community? And how you cut that cake seems to me to be absolutely the nub of our issue at the moment.
Jeremy, do you have a comment on that?
Yes, I mean, I think Jessica's put that in a really clear and kind of crystallized way, and I think that is she's captured kind of beautifully the dilemma I think we face. I mean, you've only got to go north of the border to look at a Calvinist church, in effect, a Presbyterian church that is organised around a parish system, and ministers in the Church of Scotland will talk about the parish in ways that are thoroughly familiar to Church of England ministers, but they're facing the same dilemmas really, and the same kind of questions of identity and challenges about missions. So I don't think there is sometimes a kind of myth around that what's unique about Anglicanism is its ministry to all in one place, or everyone in one place. That isn't strictly true. I mean, I think it's something we ought to be, personally, I think we ought to be proud of, and we should certainly aspire to continue to be able to deliver. But it is essentially what's true of the whole of the Western Church. This is a system that evolved in across Western Europe as a way of supplying ministry to every community, and the dilemmas are much the same across Northern Europe down into France, Italy, Spain, and so on. What do you do in many cases with this extraordinary inheritance of medieval buildings when the communities have largely gone, for example? Or what do you do when the communities are no longer interested in going to church actively, and so on? What's the role of the church then? And in some ways we're better placed than some of those churches, in some ways not so well placed. So yeah.
Jeremy, that's really interesting that you draw in on that international aspect, because of course you are the National Advisor for Ecumenical Relations at the Church of England. So I wonder then, sort of building on what you've already said, is there anything that we can learn positively from experiences, either ecumenical or international, of pastoral reorganisation that's going on elsewhere that could inform our conversation?
I was rather dreading this question, Matthew, because I honestly don't know the answer to it. I don't know enough about what churches in other countries have been trying to do. I suspect that the answer is they're grappling with and facing the same problems, same opportunities, same difficulties as we face. What I do know is that it's always interesting to look at what other churches do. I was in Finland a couple of weeks ago, and I was part of a group who meeting from across Northern Europe, and we went to an inner city church in Tampere in Finland that had an extraordinary ministry to refugees and those on the street. And it was really inspirational and fascinating to see how they'd done it and how they'd serviced it, and the reception amongst the local community, at least as far as we could tell. So there are always interesting things to be learnt from looking wider than your own community, your own church. Yes, absolutely.
And Matthew, obviously, you're now in the church in Wales. I wonder whether you have any experience there that could inform the conversation.
Well, yes. The church in Wales, of course, is considerably smaller, both in terms of the number of dioceses we have, and then most of those dioceses are smaller than you would generally consider as a standardised English diocese. I think most of our dioceses are equivalent to some of the smallest dioceses that you have in the C of E. It's quite a difficult one, this, because the Church in Wales has very intentionally been moving towards a new system, which are called ministry areas, and the idea of those essentially is a slightly more modernised version of the team ministry model that's familiar in England. You're taking a wider geographical area, and you're hopefully having a team of clergy, whether that's a team of paid clergy or whether that's an incumbent who's stipendiary with house for duty and non-stipendiary assistants and lay assistants, and ministering over a far wider geographical area than we traditionally have as parishes. But from the lawyer's point of view, I look at them and I see an incumbent, I see some assistant clergy, I see one main body of lay leadership formed into a council. And some subcommittees below that, and I look at that and say that's a parish. It's a parish with several churches, and it's a parish operating over a wider area in the 21st century than it did in the 20th or the 19th. But it probably takes most people about the same time to get to the centre of that ministry unit as it did in the 19th and 18th century. It's just that they're going by trains, buses and cars rather than on foot or on horseback. So lots is changing, but actually lots is staying the same in our model. And as ever, we're only a few years into it, and the difficulty is it's quite difficult to measure these things in anything less than a 5 or 10 year timescale. And I think the scary thing for us in Wales, as it probably is in England, is we don't have that many multiples of 5 years or 10 years to go before we really do hit crisis point in resourcing the church, both financially and numerically. But we're determined not to go into the good night doing nothing, and so this is our latest attempt at structuring as in an agile way for the needs of Wales in this century.
Thank you, Matthew.
Well, I'm conscious that we've tried to cover a ludicrous amount of ground in just half an hour, and in a sense, I mean, all we've been able to do is show the depth of the theological, historical, and legal conversation that needs to be had. But we're incredibly grateful to the three of you, Matthew, Jessica, and Jeremy, for joining us. Thank you so much for that. And thank you to everyone who has listened. Just some encouragement for you to tune in to our next episode, which will be focusing on the cure of souls within the parish system, with Archdeacon Javid Iqbal, Julia Burton-Jones, and Bishop Andrew Rumsey. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.